Tonight, we slip into the shadows of history, into graveyards not as mourners, but as thieves. The grave robber wasn't a monster, not always. Sometimes desperate, sometimes hired, sometimes simply curious. Armed with a shovel, a lantern, and a strong stomach, they worked in silence, dodging guards, superstition, and the ever-present stench of judgment. This isn't a tale of horror. It's about what people will do for profit, for medicine, for survival, and how even in death, some bodies weren't allowed to rest. If you enjoy drifting into these quieter, stranger corners of the past, consider liking the video and subscribing. It really helps us keep unearthing these sleep-worthy stories. And here's something to ponder before sleep. What do you think drove someone to dig where no one else dared? Desperation, greed, or something stranger? Leave your thoughts in the comments. I always enjoy seeing the different ways we interpret the past. Now breathe gently, let the fog roll in, and follow me between the stones. In the soft hush of an early 19th century evening, the city of Edinburgh sat quietly beneath a blanket of fog. Gas lamps flickered along the cobbled streets, their dim light pushing back the mist in small glowing circles. The scent of coal smoke drifted through the air, mingling with the faint aroma of damp earth. Church bells had long since tolled the hour, and most respectable folk were tucked away in their homes, shutters drawn and fires lit. But beyond the edge of warmth and civility, another kind of life stirred in the darkness. The graveyard waited. Behind its wrought iron gates and crumbling stone walls, rows of headstones stood like weary sentinels. Here the earth was never truly still. By day, the cemetery belonged to mourners and clergy. By night, it belonged to the resurrection men. To be a grave robber, though they preferred the term resurrectionist, was to exist in a space between shame and necessity. These were not the thieves of jewels or gold, but of flesh and bone. They came with sacks, shovels and lanterns, not to desecrate out of malice, but to meet the insatiable hunger of the medical schools. Medical science in the early 1800s was on the brink of transformation. Surgeons and physicians pressed to understand the intricacies of the human body, to treat injuries with more than superstition and guesswork. But the law forbade the use of most corpses for dissection. Executed criminals were one of the few legal sources, and they were too few by far. Thus, a grim economy arose, one fed by the dead, enabled by the living. The resurrection men worked in teams. One watched the road, another worked the spade. They moved quickly and quietly, knowing that time was not their friend. A freshly buried body was best, before decay set in, before the family placed iron cages or stone slabs over the grave. Speed was everything. They would remove the earth in silence, peel back the coffin lid, and extract the body without disturbing clothing or valuables. Robbery of goods was a criminal offence. Robbery of the body, oddly enough, was often treated with more leniency. One such man, known to the locals only as Thomas, was a fixture in Edinburgh's shadowed corners. By day he was a porter or a chimney sweep, but by night he descended into the world of the grave. He did not speak much about his work, even to the few who knew. There was a kind of code among resurrectionists: silence, discretion, and caution. But in his eyes there lived the weight of knowledge, of cold earth beneath the fingernails, of the soft resistance of damp soil, and of the moment when a coffin lid creaked open. Thomas did not see himself as evil. In his mind, he was part of something larger. Without men like him, the surgeons at Surgeons' Hall could not teach. Students would go into the world half-blind, ignorant of the workings of the very bodies they sought to heal. It was easy sometimes to justify the work, yet the job carried other burdens. A graveyard at midnight was not just a place of soil and stone. It was thick with silence, pierced only by the occasional hoot of an owl or the whisper of a breeze through skeletal trees. The air felt different, charged, almost sacred. Every sound seemed louder, every shadow longer, and always there was the lingering sense of being watched, not by men but by something older. The moral weight pressed on them all. Some drowned it with drink, others with bravado, but now and then a man would simply walk away, unable to bear another night of the dead's embrace. Thomas had seen it before. Strong men broken not by danger, but by conscience, he understood. The work chipped at the soul, flake by flake. Still, the demand never ceased. Edinburgh's medical schools paid well. A fresh body could fetch several shillings, a small fortune for a man like Thomas. It meant meat on the table, coal in the hearth. It meant survival in a city that offered few honest chances to the poor. And so he returned, again and again, lantern in hand, boots caked with mud. In time he came to know the cemeteries better than the streets. He could tell which graves had been watched, which had been left exposed. He knew the schedules of the watchmen, the habits of the mourners, and the shifting moods of the earth itself. The graveyards were his workshop, and though the work brought shame and secrecy, it also brought a strange sense of mastery. In a world that looked down on him, here was a place where he was expert. The city, for its part, turned a blind eye. The authorities railed against the practice publicly, but few genuine efforts were made to stop it. Everyone knew the surgeons needed bodies. Everyone knew where they came from. And so a grim dance continued, one step ahead of the law, one step deeper into the night. As Thomas prepared for another evening's work, he packed his tools with methodical care. The spade, worn smooth by use, the canvas sack, large enough to carry what was needed, a flask of whiskey, not for courage, but for the cold, and the lantern, its glow barely enough to light a man's feet, but too bright to be seen from the road. Tonight, the target was a young man, newly buried, a dock worker who had drowned in the Leith. No family, no headstone yet. An easy job, if any such thing existed. He moved through the alleyways like smoke, silent and unnoticed. In the fog, he was little more than a shadow among shadows. When he reached the cemetery wall, he paused, not for fear, but for reverence. A brief moment, no more than a breath. Then he slipped over, swallowed once more by the world of the dead. The night stretched long ahead, and beneath the ground, the past waited to be unearthed. Grave Robber Story, Part 2. The fog had thickened by the time Thomas hoisted himself over the cemetery wall, landing softly in the wet grass on the other side. He crouched low, the lantern in his hand turned down to the lowest flame. The world here seemed suspended, as if time moved differently among the graves. Sounds felt muted, the night holding its breath. He moved with practiced care between the rows, his boots making no more noise than a whisper. The smell of damp stone and fresh-turned earth mingled in the air. Somewhere nearby, a raven let out a low croak before flapping off into the mist. Thomas paused briefly, adjusting the sack slung over his shoulder. He had been to this particular plot many times before. The soil here was softer, the bodies buried hastily. It was a poor man's graveyard, easy pickings by the standards of the trade. He found the fresh mound easily. The earth was still uneven, the shape of the coffin barely visible beneath the thin crust of dirt. A wooden marker stood at the head, etched with little more than initials. The grave was young, not more than 2 days old, and untouched by mourners since the burial. Thomas placed his lantern down and began to dig. The work was slow and steady, deliberate in its silence. The spade sliced through the topsoil with ease, the sound dampened by the blanket of fog above. He worked in a rhythm, scooping and pausing, listening for any noise beyond the perimeter. It was not uncommon for others to wander the graveyards. Rival resurrectionists, curious onlookers, or worse, guards. But tonight the city seemed too deep in sleep to notice. As he dug, his thoughts wandered, as they often did in these long hours. He thought of the man beneath the soil, drowned in the docks, unclaimed by kin. What had his life been like? Had he known laughter or love? Had he hoped for something more than this silent end? These were dangerous thoughts. The more one humanized the dead, the heavier the work became. And yet, Thomas could never quite stop them. After an hour of steady labour, his spade struck wood. He paused, catching his breath. The coffin was simple, unvarnished pine. He cleared the dirt from the lid carefully, working around the edges until he could pry it open. The smell hit him first, not decay, not yet, but the cold, earthy scent of death beginning to take hold. Inside lay the man, arms crossed over his chest, eyes closed, as if still waiting to wake. Thomas moved quickly now. He reached in, lifted the body with a grunt, and wrapped it in linen before placing it into the sack. There was no ceremony, no prayer, only silence and urgency. The job was nearly done. He replaced the lid and scattered the earth back over the grave, tamping it down just enough to make it seem untouched. The marker was returned to its place. From a distance, the plot looked as it had when he arrived, another forgotten soul in a forgotten corner. With the sack over his shoulder, Thomas slipped back through the rows and out into the alley beyond. The city was still asleep. By dawn, the body would be on its way to the anatomy theatre. The surgeons would receive it with quiet gratitude, the students with sharpened tools and eager minds. It would be dissected, studied, labelled, and learned from, and then it would be gone, reduced to lessons and memory. Thomas, meanwhile, would be back in his lodgings, a cramped room above a grocer's shop in the old town. He would sleep through the morning, wake in the afternoon, and eat a meagre meal before preparing for the next night. It was a life of odd hours, and even odder company. Few knew what he did, fewer still asked. In the daylight, the city wore a different face. The same streets that had hidden him in the fog now bustled with life. Market stalls cried out, carriages rattled along cobblestones, and chimney smoke curled from every rooftop. No one looked twice at Thomas as he walked among them. That was the point. He passed the medical school on his way home. Outside, a group of young men in long coats gathered around a professor, their breath clouding in the cold air. They laughed, pointing to a diagram chalked onto a slate board. Thomas paused for a moment, unseen. He wondered if they ever thought about the origins of the bodies they learned from, the men and women who had once breathed, loved, laboured. Probably not. The dead were just tools here, gateways to knowledge. He did not resent them. He envied them in truth. They had paths, careers, futures. He had shadows and secrets. That afternoon, he lay on his narrow bed, the blanket pulled up to his chin. Outside, the city moved on without him. He listened to the sounds through the thin walls. Children playing in the lane below, a vendor calling out for fish, the creak of the grocer's footsteps overhead. These were the sounds of life, but Thomas lived in the margins. Sometimes he dreamed of leaving. There were rumours of new laws being proposed, ones that would allow surgeons legal access to more bodies, perhaps even unclaimed paupers, or those who died in institutions. If that happened, resurrectionists like him would no longer be needed. It was a strange thought. What would he do then? He had no trade, no letters, no name worth mentioning. The graveyards had shaped him. Could he become something else? He shook the thought away. It was foolish to dream. For now, the work remained. And so, as evening crept once more across the city, Thomas prepared again. He cleaned his spade, refilled his flask, and patched the hole in his sack. Tonight, he would meet with his contact, a man known only as Mr. Beale, who handled the delivery to the surgeons. Their meetings were brief and always in different places. An alley one week, a stableyard the next. Trust was scarce in their trade. Beale was a thin man, with a sharp nose and a quiet voice. He spoke like someone who had seen too much and felt too little, but he paid on time, and that was all that mattered. That night, they met in the back room of an abandoned print shop. "You're early," Beale muttered, inspecting the sack with a practised hand. "Ground was soft," Thomas replied. "No watchers?" Beale nodded, placing a few coins on the table. "There's more work coming. The students are asking for comparative samples. Older bodies, unusual ones. You think you can manage that?" Thomas hesitated. Older bodies meant harder work. The soil would be dense, the coffins deeper, and they were more likely to be guarded. "I'll see what I can do." Beale gave him a curt nod and disappeared into the night. Thomas pocketed the coins and stepped out into the alley. The mist had returned. thicker than ever. It clung to the buildings like cobwebs, softening the edges of the world. He walked slowly, the weight of the night pressing down on him. In the distance, church bells began to toll. Midnight, another night in the company of the dead. And still the city slept. By the time Thomas made it home that night, his shoulders ached with the familiar heaviness of the job, and his fingers were stiff from the cold. He lit a single candle, and sat for a long while by its wavering light, warming his hands and listening to the slow creak of the building settling around him. The streets below had quieted, though the occasional clatter of hooves or murmured voices rose faintly through the floorboards. In those moments the city felt like a stranger, distant, moving to a rhythm. The next day dawned grey and still. A fine mist hung over the rooftops like a veil, softening the harsh edges of chimneys and tiles. Thomas woke with the stiffness of poor sleep and made himself a rough breakfast of bread and tea. The bread was stale, the tea bitter, but it was enough. He ate in silence, watching the window as droplets traced slow paths down the glass. Later, he ventured out into the city. He kept his head down, blending into the swirl of butchers, bootblacks and beggars that crowded Edinburgh's narrow lanes. He had errands to run, fresh oil for his lantern, a replacement handle for his spade, and preferred to move quickly and unnoticed. He paused at a stall selling second-hand coats. His was worn thin, its lining little more than threads. A sturdier one might keep the damp out better during the long hours underground. He examined a heavy wool coat with patched sleeves and a missing button. The vendor, a round-faced woman with reddened hands, eyed him warily. "Not for free," she said, wiping her nose on her sleeve. "I've coin," Thomas replied, laying down a few coppers without argument. The coat was his. As evening approached, the sky took on its familiar, pewter hue. The gas lamps flared to life, flickering in the damp air. Thomas returned home, setting out his tools for inspection. The new handle fitted well, firm and without splinters. He tested its weight in his hand, satisfied. There would be more work tonight. Beale had mentioned a new request, something peculiar, an elderly woman rumoured to have had a spinal deformity. The surgeons wanted variation, they said. Curiosities, medical anomalies. Thomas's contact in the churchyard was an old groundskeeper named Callum, who had once served as a gravedigger. Now mostly blind, he was left to tend the outer wall and ring the bells. He disliked the resurrectionists, but tolerated them when paid. He and Thomas rarely spoke. That night, they nodded at one another in the fog. Callum shuffled back into his hut, and Thomas slipped into the yard. The grave was deeper this time. Older bodies always meant more digging. The soil packed tighter by time, roots tangled thick like veins in the earth. Thomas worked methodically, pausing often to stretch his back and listen. His breath clouded the air, his face damp with sweat despite the chill. He found the coffin near dawn, its wood damp and swollen. Opening it released a dense, musty odour, heavy and sour. Inside lay the woman, small and twisted slightly to one side. Her hands were clasped tightly over her chest, her face sunken, the skin drawn like paper over bone. He worked quickly, respectfully. There was no dignity in it, but he did what he could to be gentle. The body was heavier than expected, the sack awkward to carry. He moved slowly through the graveyard, the load dragging against his spine. By the time he reached the wall, his arms were trembling. Still, he made the climb and dropped onto the far side with a soft grunt. Beale was waiting nearby as arranged. They spoke few words. The handoff was swift. "Interesting one," Beale muttered, peering inside. "They'll like this." Thomas only nodded, pocketing his pay and turning back into the fog. He walked slowly, letting his heartbeat settle, letting the city come back into focus around him. He passed by St. Giles and the open square beyond, where early vendors were beginning to set up. A cart rolled past, the driver singing softly to himself in Gaelic. Life went on. At home, Thomas stripped off his damp clothes and hung them by the stove. He made tea and drank it standing, too tired to sit. His mind swirled with fragments. The shape of the old woman's hands, the sour breath of the grave, the creak of roots under his boots. In his heart, a quiet unease stirred. He was good at burying such feelings, but sometimes they rose like steam from the kettle, impossible to ignore. He wondered what she had been like in life. Had she been kind, lonely? Was there someone out there who still whispered her name? He fell asleep thinking of her. Outside, the fog thickened once more, curling through alleys and chimney pots, softening the sharpness of the world. Tomorrow would come soon enough. Thomas awoke to the scent of old wool and faint smoke, his body reluctant to rise. The room was dim, the small square of window admitting only grey light. It had rained again in the night. The world outside was soaked and hushed, every sound softened. He sat up slowly, each joint reminding him of the labour from hours before. His back ached, a dull throb beneath the ribs. These were not the wounds of violence, but the steady erosion of effort over time, the kind that crept up without drama and stayed like. Breakfast was quiet, a hard crust of bread, dipped in lukewarm tea. He chewed slowly, methodically. The kettle steamed faintly in the corner. A thin trail of condensation streaked the glass of the window, running down like a tear. It was the kind of morning that demanded stillness, and Thomas gave it willingly. He had no plans to work that night. The body from the night before would be enough to satisfy Beale and the medical school for a few days. It was important to rest sometimes, to avoid becoming too visible. Even in a city where people looked the other way, whispers could build into trouble. So he would remain indoors, tending his tools, watching the street below from behind the faded curtains. As the day wore on, the clouds never lifted. The city moved through its routine. Deliveries clattered by in carts, children splashed through puddles in the alleys, and the bell of St. Giles tolled every quarter hour. Thomas sat with his coat in his lap, patching a worn seam with slow, precise stitches. The act was meditative, anchoring him. He let the rhythm settle him, one stitch, then another. There was comfort in maintenance, in the small rituals that kept the chaos of the world at bay. That afternoon there was a knock at the door. It startled him, not from fear, but from unfamiliarity. Few people visited him. He hesitated before answering, wiping his hands on his trousers. When he opened the door, a thin man in a charcoal coat stood in the hall, hat in hand. "Mr. Thomas?" Thomas nodded slowly. "Who's asking?" "Name's Cartwright. I work with the university. Dr. Greaves sent me." Thomas studied him. The man had the look of a clerk, ink-stained cuffs, narrow shoes, an accent that hovered near refined but slipped now and then. "What's he want?" "A special request," Cartwright said quietly, glancing over his shoulder. "Delicate. He said you're discreet." Thomas stepped aside without a word and gestured for the man to enter. Cartwright did, carefully, as if the room might break beneath his boots. Inside, Thomas poured a small cup of tea and placed it on the table. The men sat opposite one another in silence for a moment before Cartwright spoke again. "There's a woman, wealthy family, buried 2 nights ago in New Calton. She died of a seizure, sudden, unexpected. Her husband is a patron of the university, paid for the new wing, the lecture theatre. Dr. Greaves believes she may have had a rare neurological condition. He wants her studied." Thomas leaned back in his chair, arms crossed. "And the husband knows?" Cartwright hesitated. "Number, but Greaves assures us it's for the greater good." Thomas stared at the man. There was no urgency in his tone, only quiet expectation. The city had its way of justifying anything if it passed through the right mouths. "It'll be watched, you know that. We can arrange a distraction. A cleric who owes Greaves a favour. You won't be seen." There was a long silence between them, filled only by the faint ticking of the mantel clock. Thomas finally spoke. "Double the usual rate." Cartwright didn't blink. "Done?" That night, Thomas left his home without the usual hesitation. The air was colder than it had been, the wind sharper, carrying the scent of wet leaves and coal smoke. He wore his new coat and carried only what he needed. At New Calton, the iron gates were ajar, just as promised. The path beyond curved gently between rows of towering headstones, many of them marble, some engraved with Latin, others with simple verses of sorrow. These were the graves of the city's wealthy and powerful, and they were not. He found the plot with ease. A marble angel watched over it, hands clasped in grief. The earth was still soft. He worked quickly. Every motion was exact, every pause calculated. When the coffin emerged, he hesitated. It was of fine wood, varnished and gleaming even in the dim light. He opened it slowly. She lay as though asleep, her face peaceful, untouched by pain. Her hair was still curled, her hands folded neatly. Thomas felt a flicker of discomfort. This was no forgotten pauper. This was someone whose name would be remembered, whose absence had carved a hole in the hearts of others. Still, he did his work. The body was wrapped and removed with great care. The grave was restored. The angel stood again in solemn vigil. When Thomas delivered the sack to Cartwright behind the university's rear gate, the man nodded once, counted the money into his gloved hand, and disappeared into the shadows. Thomas walked home in silence. He did not sleep that night. He sat by the window and watched the city breathe, chimney smoke drifting into the stars, a distant bark echoing between rooftops, the occasional clatter of hooves on cobbles. He felt no guilt, not exactly, but a strange melancholy clung to him. There were lines he had always believed. He told himself he had never crossed them. Tonight, he wasn't so sure. The following days passed with a quiet weight that Thomas could not quite shrug off. Though the job in New Calton had been executed with the same care and efficiency as countless others before it, something about it lingered. It was not the body itself, nor the grave's opulence. Rather, it was the presence of memory in that place, the unmistakable sense that the woman had been loved, and that her resting place was not just ceremonial, but sincere. The city continued around him in its usual rhythm. The rain came and went, painting the cobbled streets in slick grey and echoing through narrow alleys. Thomas remained indoors, keeping his distance from the world. He busied himself with small tasks, mending his coat, rewrapping the handles of his tools, scrubbing mud from the soles of his boots. Each action was purposeful, but none brought peace. In the small moments of stillness, when the kettle simmered on the stove, or the fire hissed in its grate, he thought often of the angel that watched over her grave, the way its marble hands had been folded in an eternal gesture of grief. He imagined the husband, pacing a drawing room lined with dusty portraits, wondering why his wife's memory felt unsettled. The image took root in Thomas's mind and stayed there. It was not guilt in the traditional sense, it was something softer, more difficult to name. A growing awareness that the act of resurrection left more than disturbed earth behind. When Beale came, it was without ceremony. He brought news with him, and though his voice remained calm, the weight behind his words was heavier than usual. Thomas listened carefully, without speaking much. He learned that questions had been raised by the family, that the husband had requested an official exhumation for reasons unrelated to the work Thomas had done. He also learned that the university would act swiftly, as it always did, to protect its interests. The remains would be moved. No names would. The weather turned colder in the days that followed, and the wind picked up, sweeping down from the hills and through the narrow lanes like a reminder of winter's approach. Thomas walked the city at odd hours, not to work, but to feel the movement of it. He passed the old markets, the stone bridges, the halls of learning that stood like fortresses of knowledge behind locked gates. At Surgeons' Hall, he paused across the street to watch the students come and go, their eager steps and folded notebooks. At New Calton, the grave still appeared undisturbed. The marble angel stood silently in place, casting a long shadow in the fading afternoon light. Thomas stood before it for some time, his hand resting lightly on the iron fence. No one passed him. No one noticed. It was a quiet space, separated from the noise of the world, and in it he found a strange kind of stillness. That evening he returned home and sat by the window. The candle beside him flickered as the wind pressed against the glass. He stared out across the rooftops, the slate shingles slick with rain, and tried to trace the thoughts that gathered at the edges of his mind. He remembered other graves, other nights. He remembered the weight of bodies, the scent of disturbed soil, the echo of his own breath in an empty churchyard. They did not haunt him, not exactly, but they accompanied him, like shadows stretching long beneath the moonlight. There had been moments, early in his work, when he believed he would eventually grow numb to it all. That repetition would breed detachment. But over time, he found the opposite to be true. The more graves he opened, the more he noticed. The curve of a spine, the tension in a hand, the worn soles of a shoe that had once walked through life, just as he did now. Every detail pulled at the thread of humanity, refusing to be reduced to mere anatomy. In the quiet, Thomas whispered to himself, not prayers but names, names he had read on markers, names he had imagined for the unmarked. They slipped into the air like steam, dissolving quickly, but lingering just long enough to be real. He did not sleep well that night, nor did he expect to, but he stayed still, listening to the wind outside and the slow ticking of the clock, and in that space between waking and rest, he allowed himself to feel the full measure of what he carried. The city turned beneath him, unaware. Winter arrived without warning. The winds turned bitter, sweeping through the closes and winds with sharp insistence, lifting the edges of cloaks and biting at exposed skin. Frost crept across the windows in delicate patterns, and the ground beneath the city's graveyards grew rigid, unforgiving. For Thomas, the change in season meant more than discomfort. It was a reminder of how much harder the work would become. In winter, the soil clung to itself like iron, resisting the blade of the spade with a stubbornness only time could break. Digging took longer. Bodies froze faster. The damp air chilled the lungs and stung the joints, but still, the demand did not wane. The students pressed on with their studies, the lecturers with their lectures, and the resurrectionists, fewer now than before, continued their quiet trade beneath the shroud of frost and fog. Thomas kept moving through the routines, each day blurring into the next. His body grew leaner with the effort, and his sleep, when it came, was shallow. He spoke little, even to Beale, who now visited less frequently, but with more urgency. Rumours had begun to swirl, not just about inquiries or investigations, but about violence. Another resurrectionist, a man from Leith, had been caught and beaten badly by a mob of mourners who found him at the grave of a child. Word had spread quickly. The work was no. There were nights now when Thomas hesitated. He would reach the edge of a churchyard and stop, hand resting on the iron gate, eyes scanning the darkness. Sometimes he turned back. Other times he pushed forward, the cold dulling the voice of doubt. But it was there, always, not fear of arrest, but fear of erosion, that he might one day no longer recognise the face in the glass. One evening, as the sky turned the colour of slate and the street lamps flickered to life, Thomas walked to an older graveyard on the edge of the city. It had once been fashionable, a resting place for the wealthy of a previous generation. Now, many of its tombs were cracked, its stones leaning, names faded by time and rain. He passed through the broken gate in silence, his boots crunching on the thin crust of snow that lay like dust over the ground. He was not there to dig that night. He had no sack, no spade, only a lantern and his thoughts. He wandered among the stones slowly, pausing now and then to read a name, a date. He felt the history there, layered beneath his feet, centuries of grief and ritual, of farewell and forgetting. The cold air carried the scent of wet moss and iron, the quiet hum of a city holding its breath. He sat on the edge of an old tomb and looked out over the graves. From this vantage, the city's rooftops stretched beyond the wall, their chimneys breathing into the dusk. Somewhere far off, a dog barked once, then fell silent. He thought of the students again, their sharp eyes, their questions, their hunger for understanding. He did not blame them, but he wondered if they would remember the names, not just the structures and bones, but the people who had once worn them. Would they carry those echoes forward, or would they fade as so many did, reduced to diagrams and dust? The next day Thomas visited Beale. They met in a dim room behind a disused stable, the smell of hay still lingering faintly in the air. Beale handed him a note, terse as always, a request for a specific body, a woman buried in a pauper's plot, rumoured to have died in a rare position of childbirth, a curiosity, an opportunity for students to learn. Thomas folded the note and said nothing. He walked home slowly, the frost crackling beneath his feet. The request was not unusual, but the frequency was. There was a quickening now, a surge of demand that hinted at something shifting. He could feel it in the way people spoke, the way Beale moved, the way the university's windows remained lit deep into the night. That evening he prepared again. He wrapped himself in wool and canvas, filled his flask, trimmed the lantern's wick. The graveyard was further out this time, past the edge of the old city, where the houses thinned and the trees leaned in close. He followed the path in silence, the only sound his breath and the soft crunch of his steps. When he reached the burial ground, he paused. It was smaller than most, bordered by a low stone wall and dotted with plain markers. No statues here, no angels, only simple stones and simple lives. He set to work slowly, the cold biting at his fingers even through the gloves. The soil resisted, but he pushed through inch by inch. Above him, the stars blinked faintly through a haze of cloud. The night felt older here, untouched. He reached the coffin near dawn. It was shallow, the wood barely treated. Inside lay the woman, her form slight, her face turned away. There was a kind of stillness in her posture, a quiet resignation that struck Thomas unexpectedly. He worked gently, lifting her as he had done so many times before, wrapping her carefully, sealing the sack. By the time he returned to the city, the frost had thickened, tracing white veins across the streets. He made the delivery in silence, accepted the pay without counting it. Beale said nothing either. The work had become routine now, efficient, mechanical. But as Thomas walked home, he felt the weight of the woman's stillness in his arms. That night, he could not sleep. He sat by the hearth, staring into the embers, and felt the winter settle into his bones. The days grew shorter still. A pale sun drifted low across the sky, casting long shadows by mid-afternoon, before sinking quickly into dusk. Nights were longer, colder, more consuming. The fire in Thomas's room burned constantly now, a dull orange glow the only thing that kept the creeping damp from settling in the walls. Yet even the fire could not warm the places that had grown cold within him. He no longer marked time with calendars or clocks. Instead he counted nights by the number of graves disturbed, by the lantern oil he used, by the aches that deepened with each journey into the frozen earth. Each morning he awoke with the feeling of having only just lain down, the hours between digging and waking shrinking with every passing day. Though Beale's visits remained infrequent, his requests became increasingly specific. There were lists now, desired ailments, unusual deformities, particular organs of interest. Sometimes Thomas was handed sketches or crude diagrams to guide his choices. These were not general requests for the recently dead. These were demands for specimens, and they were paid accordingly. He accepted the money. But the work no longer felt like the same, quiet arrangement it once had. It was changing. The students were changing too. He saw them sometimes, gathered around the back gates of the medical school, their voices low, their eyes bright with curiosity. He heard talk of new discoveries, of journals being published in London and Paris. Anatomy was advancing, they said. The world was opening up. Yet for all this excitement, there remained a silence about how the bodies came to be there. Thomas went out less during the day. He found the light harsh, the sounds of the market grating. The laughter of children seemed to echo too sharply in the narrow lanes. He took to walking at dusk instead. moving through the mist like smoke, watching the glow of windows from a distance. In those quiet hours, he imagined lives he would never lead, dinners by firelight, letters written and replied to, a warm bed shared by choice rather than necessity. One evening, while returning from a delivery on the city's edge, he paused by an old church that had long fallen out of use. The roof sagged in places and ivy had claimed the walls, but the cemetery beside it remained. He wandered among the crooked stones, not to work but to look. The names here were worn beyond reading. Only the shapes of the letters remained, softened by wind and time. He sat on a low bench, the stone cold beneath him, and closed his eyes. The silence was not absolute. Wind in the trees, the distant roll of cartwheels, but it was enough. He felt a heaviness settle in his chest, not from labour, but from memory. He thought of the first body he had ever lifted. A young boy, he remembered, drowned in a canal. He had been smaller than the sack they used to carry him. Thomas had not been the one to dig that night. He had only watched, and yet the image had stayed with him. It occurred to him as the mist curled low over the graves that he had not spoken a full sentence to another person in days. His world had narrowed to the clink of coin, the scrape of iron on earth, and the weight of silence. The walls of his room, once a refuge, now felt like the inside of a box being slowly nailed shut. That night, back in his lodging, he lit no fire. He sat by the window, wrapped in his coat, watching frost creep across the glass. He drank the last of his whiskey, not for warmth, but for quiet. He thought of the students again, their futures, their confidence, their ignorance. He wondered if any of them truly grasped what their knowledge cost, not just in coin, but in labour, in memory, in the invisible toll paid by those who did the work they chose not to see. The candle burned low, its light flickering weakly against the cold. Thomas remained awake, listening to the ticking of the clock, the creak of the building settling into its frame. Outside, the snow began to fall, slow, steady, soft as ash. He did not sleep. The snow did not lift for days. It fell thick across the city, muffling the clatter of hooves, blanketing rooftops, and turning alleyways into pale corridors of silence. Edinburgh seemed suspended, caught between breath and exhale, its corners softened and stilled beneath the cold. The graveyards in particular took on an eerie beauty, headstones dusted in white, statues crowned with frost, the earth beneath untouched and hard as slate. For Thomas, the snow brought both relief and burden. On one hand, it made the graveyards less frequented, fewer mourners or guards to navigate. On the other, it made the work nearly impossible. The ground was not just cold but frozen solid. A single grave might take twice as long to open, and the risk of injury rose with every minute spent wrenching at iron-bound soil. He spent much of his time indoors, hunched by the small hearth, the flame never quite enough to push back the damp chill that crept through the floorboards. His coat, heavy and worn, hung by the door, perpetually damp. Some days he did not leave at all. He sat instead at his table, carving notches into the handle of his spade, or polishing the lantern's glass until his fingers ached. There were fewer requests from Beale now. Whether this was due to the weather, or something deeper, Thomas couldn't say. The silence was not comforting. It made the world feel thinner, as if he might fall through it if he moved too quickly. He began to dream more, strange half-lit dreams, filled with quiet voices and shallow graves, where bodies whispered from beneath the frost and angels watched without blinking. One afternoon, he walked the South Bridge, just as dusk settled over the city. The sky above was streaked with bruised grey, the gas lamps throwing pools of amber on the snow-covered stone. Below him, the Cowgate was hushed, only the sound of a single carriage, creaking in the distance. He stopped mid-bridge and leaned on the balustrade, staring down into the gathering dark. He thought of the bodies again, not just the dead he had lifted, but the living who had once carried those names. The child from Leith, the dock worker, the woman from New Calton. They returned to him not as corpses, but as moments, a lock of hair, a scrap of cloth, the weight of a hand gone cold. He had tried once to forget, but he no longer believed forgetting was the way. He left the bridge before the lamps were fully lit. That evening, back in his room, he received a letter. It was folded neatly, slipped under his door without a knock. The handwriting was precise, the ink faded slightly by damp. It was from someone he did not know, or perhaps someone who chose not to name themselves. The message was short. I know what you do, and I know why it matters. If you ever want it to stop, really stop, there is a place in the north. A quiet place. Ask for Lark. There was no signature. He read it twice, then burned it in the fire. The next day, he worked. The graveyard was small and frozen, but the request was clear. A man, unclaimed, with visible scarring to the chest. The medical school wanted to examine the healing of deep wounds. A rare find, and time-sensitive. Thomas dug through ice and stone, each strike of the spade sending a tremor through his wrists. It took hours. His breath came in clouds. His knees ached. But he did the job. The man was young, his face calm. The scars, just as described, ran across the chest like rivers on a map. Thomas wrapped the body in silence, the cold air brittle around him. When he lifted the sack to his shoulder, it felt heavier than most, not in weight, but in consequence. The streets were nearly empty as he returned. Snow fell in soft spirals beneath the glow of the lamps. He passed shuttered shops, empty courts, and the university's great door, locked for the night, yet still echoing with the footsteps of those who had come before. Beale waited at the usual place, under the archway by the print yard. No words were exchanged, only coin and a glance. Back home, Thomas warmed his hands by the fire and thought of the letter, a place in the north, a name he did not know. He had never considered leaving. Not truly. This city had been the whole of his life, its stone and smoke, its shadows and graves. But now the thought lingered. Not escape, not redemption, just quiet. He let the fire die low that night and did not relight it. The days moved slowly in the aftermath of the letter, but something had shifted. Thomas felt it in the way he walked, in the way his thoughts stretched beyond the city's edge. He moved through his routines with the same care as always, oiling his tools, checking the seams of his sack, trimming the wick on his lantern. But now there was a distance in him, as though part of his mind stood outside the room, watching. The letter had been a simple thing, a few lines on a page, but it had stirred the settle. He found himself lingering longer in the graveyards, not out of hesitance or danger, but reflection. He wandered among the tombs before setting to work, reading names aloud to himself in a whisper. It became a kind of ritual, a nod to the lives before the task. He wasn't sure when it had begun, but now he could not skip it. It felt necessary, a tether to something he could no longer name. One night, in the burial ground near the church at St. Cuthbert's, he paused beside a marker that bore no name, only the initials TM and a date from 3 decades past. The grave was not his target. He had come for someone newly buried in the far corner, but he stood before it anyway, hand resting on the cold stone. There was something about the brevity of the inscription that struck him. No dates of birth or death, no verses, just those letters, carved deep and clean. He closed his eyes and breathed. When he did begin the night's work, the frost made each movement laboured. He chipped at the topsoil, working down inch by inch, the rhythm slower now, more deliberate. He thought of the place mentioned in the letter, a northern town, quiet, unknown. Perhaps there were jobs to be found there, honest ones, labour in a mill, work on a farm, things he knew nothing about but had always assumed were beyond him. The thought returned again and again, settling in the corners of his mind like ash. The target that night was a man from the workhouse, elderly, unclaimed, buried in haste. The medical school wanted to study his joints, the effects of age and hardship on the structure of bone. It was not an unusual request, and yet it filled Thomas with a strange sadness. To live through so many years, to endure, and to be reduced in death to a case study. He tried not to dwell on it, but the thoughts clung to him, even as he worked. The coffin was crude, barely sealed. The body within was thin, the skin drawn tight over the brow. Thomas moved carefully, lifting and wrapping, sealing and settling the earth behind him once more. He placed a stone where the head had rested, a habit he'd developed recently. It was not a marker. There would be no one to see it, but it felt like something, a gesture. On the way back, snow began to fall again. It was light this time, drifting like feathers, barely touching the ground before melting. The streets were quiet, the city huddled under its own silence. He passed by the university, its great windows glowing faintly. Inside, men moved like shadows behind the glass, coats buttoned high, voices low with the business of knowledge. He wondered, not for the first time, if any of them would remember him. Not his name, but his part. He delivered the body in silence. Beale looked tired. He said little, only nodded and handed over the coin. When Thomas reached home, he sat for a long time at the edge of his bed. His boots dripped meltwater onto the floor. He did not undress. Instead, he reached into the small tin he kept beneath the bed and pulled out the few possessions he had saved. A broken pipe, a brass button from his father's coat, a lock of hair he no longer remembered cutting. He looked at them one by one, then placed them back. The next day, he left the city for the first time in years. It was not a dramatic departure. No goodbyes, no packed bags. He wore his coat, carried a satchel, and walked north along the road that led out past the last of the buildings, past the fields stubbled with frost, past the quiet places that no longer bore names. The snow had thinned by then, the ground hard beneath his boots, the air sharp and clean. He did not know exactly where he was going, only that it was away from the graves, the fog, the hush of things left unsaid. As he walked, he thought not of the past, but of soil untouched, of ground that had never been broken, of names not yet lost. The road north wound through hills and hollows, through mist and stone-walled fields, through villages where the smoke from chimneys hung low in the air. Thomas walked slowly, unhurried, letting each mile settle into his bones. With every step, the city receded. Its noise, its weight, its graves. The silence here was different. It was not the hush of hidden things, but the quiet of wind in heather, and the rustle of dry bracken on frosted slopes. He spent his first nights in barns, in way stations, once in a shepherd's hut, left open for travellers. He carried little more than bread, a flask, and the thought of the letter still etched in his memory. A place in the north, ask for Lark. He did not know what Lark was, a man, a house, a symbol, only that it had been offered in earnest. That was enough. Eventually, he reached a coastal village with low squat houses and nets hanging to dry. The sea lay flat and grey beyond the harbour wall. He asked for Lark in the inn, his voice low. The barkeep, a woman with hair tied in a rough knot, looked at him a long time before pointing to a path at the edge of the dunes. The cottage stood alone, back to the wind, facing the sea. It was stone-built, with weathered shutters and a door bleached by salt. There was smoke from the chimney, but no sound. Thomas approached, not with caution, but with the quiet certainty of someone who has already made the decision to stay. Inside he found warmth. A fire glowed in the hearth, and a man sat beside it, mending a net. He looked up, nodded once, and gestured to the empty chair opposite him. No questions were asked, none were needed. In the weeks that followed, Thomas worked in silence. He mended fences, he hauled fish from the nets, he patched roofs and fed chickens. It was hard work, honest and blunt, but it left no stain on his mind. At night, he sat by the fire with the others, 3 men, 2 women, all quiet people, and listened. Sometimes someone would hum a tune, sometimes no one spoke at all. It suited him. The dreams did not leave entirely. Now and then, he would see the pale curve of a grave in frost, the flicker of a lantern, the press of cold soil against his skin. But they came less often, and when they did, they left more softly. He no longer woke in panic. He no longer woke with names on his tongue. Lark, he learned, was not a person, but a word used by the villagers for people who left things behind. There were others like him, not grave robbers perhaps, but men and women who had borne too much of one world and needed to try another. It was a word of welcome, of possibility. Spring came slowly. The wind softened, the frost retreated. Buds appeared on the trees that lined the edge of the field, behind the cottage. Thomas planted potatoes, his hands deep in the earth. The soil was rich, dark, clean. He turned it with care. One evening, standing at the edge of the cliffs, he looked out over the sea as the sun dipped low behind a veil of clouds. The light turned the water to pewter. Gulls circled, silent in the wind. He stood there a long time, feeling the air on his face, his breath slow and steady. He thought of Edinburgh, of fog and stone, of cold graves and colder men. He thought of the bodies, yes, but also of what they gave, not just to science but to him. A strange kind of understanding. The weight of silence, the value of small mercies. He did not regret it, but he did not wish to return. That night, as he sat by the fire, one of the women, Elspeth, handed him a cup of tea and asked gently where he had come from. Thomas looked into the fire. Then he looked at her. A long way, he said, and left it at that. Outside, the wind stirred the heather. The sea whispered against the rocks, and the world for once felt still. Reflections on grave robbing. Throughout history, the act of grave robbing has stirred a potent mix of revulsion, fascination, and moral conflict. Though often thought of as a macabre fringe practice, grave robbing, or more specifically, body snatching, was a widespread and pivotal phenomenon in the development of modern science and medicine. To understand why it occurred, we must begin by looking at the social, legal, and scientific contexts in which it thrived. In the 18th and early 19th century Europe, particularly in Britain, the study of human anatomy was undergoing a significant transformation. Advances in medical education demanded a deeper understanding of the human body, and dissection became an essential tool for teaching and research. Surgeons in training, physicians, and anatomists required real human cadavers to practice and learn from, not just sketches or models. The shift was profound. Anatomy was no longer a theoretical discipline. However, the law did not keep pace with these scientific needs. At the time, the only legally sanctioned source of cadavers for dissection in Britain was the bodies of executed criminals. Capital punishment was not uncommon, but even so, the number of executions was far too low to meet the growing demand from medical schools. Furthermore, as public sentiment began to shift against the death penalty, even fewer bodies became available. This scarcity created a black market, a grim economy. Grave robbing, or resurrectionism, as it was known euphemistically, filled the void. The term resurrectionist was often preferred by those who carried out the work, suggesting that they were not stealing, but rather repurposing the body for a higher calling, the advancement of medical knowledge. These individuals often worked in teams, a digger, a lookout, a carrier. They targeted recent graves, preferably those of the poor and unguarded, where burials were simpler and less likely to be protected. The methods were practical and efficient. A typical resurrectionist would wait until a burial had taken place, ideally within the last 24 to 72 hours. The grave would be approached at night, usually in remote or dimly lit areas, and excavated from the head of the coffin to minimize damage. Care was taken not to remove clothing or valuables, as theft of those items was considered a criminal offence, whereas the act of removing the body itself often fell into a murkier legal category. The motivations behind grave robbing varied. For some it was economic necessity. The pay for a single cadaver could amount to several weeks' wages for an unskilled labourer. For others it was a tolerated, if morally dubious occupation, often carried out under the informal patronage of the very institutions that publicly decried the practice. Medical schools, desperate for specimens, often turned a blind eye to the origins of their supplies. Payments were made discreetly, and questions were rarely asked. The moral dilemmas were complex. To the public, grave robbing was a profound violation of religious and cultural norms surrounding death and burial. In Christian societies, the body was seen as sacred, destined for resurrection at the end of days. Disturbing the dead was a blasphemous act, and for grieving families, the thought of a loved one's remains being stolen was horrifying. As a result, security measures became increasingly elaborate. Families hired grave watchers, cemeteries were outfitted with security. Still, the grave robbers persisted. In cities like Edinburgh, London, and Dublin, resurrectionists became part of the urban folklore. They worked in darkness, slipping through alleys and across frozen fields, returning with their burden before dawn. In many ways, they were both feared and needed, the dark mirror to scientific progress. Perhaps the most infamous example of this uneasy relationship came in the form of Burke and Hare, two men who began by stealing corpses in 1820s. Edinburgh, but quickly escalated to murder in order to meet the demands of local anatomists. Their crimes shocked the public and exposed the grim underbelly of anatomical science. Burke was hanged and publicly dissected, a macabre form of poetic justice, and his skeleton remains on display to this day. Yet even in the wake of such horror, the core issue remained. The demand for cadavers vastly outstripped the legal supply, and so grave robbing continued, often hidden in plain sight, as society struggled to reconcile its respect for the dead with its hunger for medical advancement. To understand the mechanics and risks of grave robbing, we must step away from the sterile halls of anatomy theatres and look closely at those who performed the work. The resurrectionists, the unofficial workforce behind the expansion of anatomical study, were a diverse and often misunderstood group. While some may imagine them as criminal masterminds or Gothic caricatures, the truth was usually more ordinary, and in some ways more tragic. Most resurrectionists were poor working-class men with few other means of income. They came from trades that already placed them near the dead: gravediggers, porters, night watchmen, and even undertakers. These professions offered the skills and access required for body snatching, familiarity with cemeteries, knowledge of burial practices, and the physical strength to dig and carry a body over long distances. For many, it was a grim side job, not a chosen career, but one born out of necessity. The work was grueling and dangerous. A typical night might begin well before midnight, with the team gathering in silence, carrying shovels, sacks, ropes, and often a lantern shielded to dim its glow. Speed was critical. It took precision to unearth a coffin without drawing attention or collapsing the walls of the grave. Resurrectionists often dug at the head of the grave to expose just enough of the coffin to break it open and extract the body. The clothing was usually left behind. Transporting the body posed its own risks. Corpses were typically bundled into sacks and slung over shoulders, or dragged on stretchers covered in cloth. Some teams used carts disguised as hay wagons or delivery vehicles. In larger cities, tunnels and alleys provided hidden paths between the graveyard and the school. The journey had to be swift and discreet, not just because of the law, but because of the unpredictable dangers posed by bystanders or rival crews. Indeed, resurrectionists often faced more immediate threats from the public than from the authorities. The theft of a loved one's body was seen as a vile, almost unforgivable act, and mobs would form quickly if a grave robber was caught in the act. Graveyard riots were not uncommon. In response, some robbers carried weapons or travelled in groups large enough to fend off attackers. Others used bribes paid to cemetery staff, watchmen, or even local officials to ensure access or protection. Despite the dangers, the trade persisted. There was demand and there was money. In cities like Edinburgh and London, a skilled resurrectionist could make the equivalent of several £100s a year, a tempting income for men otherwise condemned to hard labour and poverty. The schools did not ask questions. They paid by the body, no matter how it was obtained. There were even accounts of surgeons placing specific orders for bodies with certain conditions, age groups, or causes of death. This practical detachment created an unspoken system. Resurrectionists operated in the shadows, surgeons in the lamplight, and between them, a strange complicity. In rare cases, some resurrectionists became minor celebrities in the medical world. Their knowledge of anatomy and pathology, gained through observation and repetition, was sometimes considerable. A few even found themselves hired as assistants or porters within medical institutions, but for most, their work was anonymous, their contribution unspoken. Society's response, however, was not passive. As awareness of body snatching grew, so too did the effort to stop it. Families employed grave watchers, individuals who stood vigil over fresh graves, sometimes in shifts, armed and alert. Others purchased protective devices known as mortsafes, heavy iron cages or grills placed over the grave to prevent disturbance. These could be permanent or temporary, removed after the danger period of a few weeks had passed. In some wealthier cemeteries, watchtowers were built. Religious institutions were often deeply opposed to resurrectionism. Sermons condemned the practice as a sin against the sanctity of the dead. In Christian doctrine, the body was believed to be resurrected at the end of time, and disturbing its rest was seen as a threat to this promise. This added a spiritual dimension to the public's horror, intensifying outrage and deepening the divide between science and religion. Despite these tensions, the trade remained resilient. It was not a profession that required loyalty or permanence. Resurrectionists came and went, disappearing into the slums or back streets when the work grew too risky. But the need never ceased. As long as medical schools expanded and dissections were central to learning, the demand for bodies would continue. And so, grave robbing became institutionalized in its own way, an unofficial, unacknowledged part of the medical system. It was never written into law, rarely recorded in official histories, and often denied by those who benefited from it most. Yet without these men, the development of surgery, anatomy, and clinical diagnosis would have been crippled. They were the hidden scaffolding on which modern medicine was built. To grasp the full impact of grave robbing, we must turn our attention to the institutions that benefited most from the practice: the medical schools and teaching hospitals of the 18th and 19th centuries. These institutions were the crucibles of scientific progress, and yet their brightest advancements were often fueled by the quiet, unsettling trade in stolen corpses. The paradox is stark. Grave robbing, a practice so widely condemned, laid the foundation for some of the greatest medical breakthroughs. By the early 1700s, the study of human anatomy was rapidly evolving from a niche interest of learned men into a vital discipline within mainstream medicine. Before this shift, anatomy had largely been studied through animal dissection, speculative diagrams, or limited access to human bodies, typically those of criminals or victims of war. But as universities expanded their medical faculties, it became clear that hands-on experience with the human form was not just helpful, but essential. Medical students needed to see and touch the intricate architecture of the body. They had to understand the placement of muscles, the curves of bones, the branching of arteries. Cadavers offered what no book or model could: a real and complex system, filled with variation, pathology, and the evidence of lived experience. As one surgeon famously said, "To cut is to cure, but to cut one must first see." Anatomical theatres, purpose-built rooms where dissections were performed before students and professors, became key features of major universities. These spaces were usually circular, with tiers of seats rising above a central table, At the heart of it all lay the cadaver, surrounded by tools, chalkboards, and quiet reverence. These were not spectacles of death, but of education, if one could ignore how the body came to be there. The benefits were immense. Surgeons trained in dissection became far more skilled in diagnosis, wound care, and surgery. Physicians who studied real bodies could better understand disease, not just in theory but in practice. The medical field was slowly prying itself away from superstition, and cadaveric study was one of its most powerful tools. Pathology, the study of disease in organs and tissue, blossomed as a result of dissection. Doctors began to correlate external symptoms with internal abnormalities. Conditions that once baffled physicians, like tuberculosis, cirrhosis, or aneurysms, became clearer through repeated observation. Dissected bodies told silent stories, and those stories began to shape modern medicine. At the same time, there was a darker side to this progress. Because most of the bodies came from the poor, the marginalised, or the unclaimed, the education of the elites was built quite literally on the backs of the voiceless. There was no consent, no dignity, no ceremony for the vast majority of cadavers. They were seen as instruments, not individuals. This created a hierarchy of worth, the living deemed valuable enough to learn, the dead deemed disposable enough to be used. In many ways, this echoes broader patterns in history. Societies often justify uncomfortable practices in the name of advancement. And while the benefits of anatomical study are undeniable, the method of procurement, through grave robbing and exploitation, leaves behind an ethical legacy that cannot be ignored. Indeed, this moral dissonance began to trouble even those within the medical establishment. Some surgeons and students, while acknowledging the necessity of dissection, expressed discomfort at the means by which bodies were obtained. There are journals and letters from the period in which students describe their unease, their conflicted feelings about cutting into someone who might have once walked the same streets, lived a parallel life. Public dissections of executed criminals had long been used as both punishment and deterrent. But the quiet dissections of the poor, performed behind closed doors and beyond the reach of public knowledge, felt different. They weren't meant as punishment, but they weren't acts of respect either. They existed in a liminal space, necessary but hidden. The cumulative result of this practice was transformative. By the early 19th century, medical science had made remarkable strides. The foundations of modern surgery, internal medicine, and forensic pathology had been laid. Hospitals were becoming cleaner, more organised, more effective. Medical professionals were no longer seen merely as barbers or apothecaries, but as highly trained experts, grounded in empirical knowledge. And yet, the roots of this transformation were tangled in secrecy and transgression. The very cadavers that made such learning possible had often been carried under moonlight, wrapped in rough cloth, lifted from freshly dug graves, while mourners still wept. As grave robbing persisted throughout the 18th and early 19th centuries, public opinion steadily hardened against it. What had once been whispered rumours began to take centre stage in newspapers, town meetings, and eventually the halls of government. Grave robbing was no longer an open secret. It was a scandal, and one that threatened to undermine public trust in both science and society. The moral, legal, and cultural backlash that followed would eventually lead to sweeping reforms, including one of... At the heart of the public reaction was a visceral sense of violation. The idea that a loved one's body, buried with care and ritual, might be dug up in the night and used for dissection sparked outrage across class lines. While the poor were far more likely to have their graves robbed, even wealthier families began to worry about the security of their dead. Newspapers published reports of disturbed cemeteries, missing corpses, and confrontations with so-called body snatchers. Satirical prints show. This outrage led to a variety of responses. In some cities, communities formed organised watch clubs to monitor graveyards for days or weeks after a burial. These groups operated in shifts, armed with lanterns, dogs, and even firearms. Some families hired guards or purchased costly protective devices such as mortsafes, heavy wrought iron cages placed over graves. In other places, people poured quicklime over coffins or buried their loved ones with explosives triggered by tampering. The tension between medical necessity and moral outrage finally reached a breaking point with the infamous Burke and Hare case in 1828. Unlike traditional resurrectionists, Burke and Hare bypassed the graveyard entirely. They murdered at least 16 people in Edinburgh and sold the bodies directly to an anatomy lecturer, Dr. Robert Knox. When they were caught, the public was horrified. This wasn't body snatching, it was industrialised killing for profit, and it exposed how far the demand for cadavers had gone. In the aftermath, reform was inevitable. The British Parliament, recognising the untenable nature of the system, passed the Anatomy Act of 1832. This landmark legislation fundamentally changed the legal landscape surrounding dissection. For the first time, medical institutions were granted lawful access to unclaimed bodies from hospitals, prisons, and workhouses. While this did little to address the deeper ethical questions, it effectively ended the need for grave robbing by providing a regulated supply. The Anatomy Act was both a triumph and a compromise. On one hand, it protected cemeteries and gave medical schools the legal access they had long sought. On the other, it quietly shifted the burden of dissection onto the bodies of the poor. Those who died without family or financial means, particularly in public institutions, were now eligible for medical use. Consent was rarely sought or required. In effect, the law codified a hierarchy of bodily autonomy. Over time, these provisions were refined and modern ethics slowly emerged. Consent began to be discussed more openly in medical circles. Informed permission from donors or families became standard practice, but the roots of that change are deeply entangled with the grave robbers of old, who forced society to confront the question, whose bodies are we willing to learn from? The backlash against resurrectionism also left its mark on the public imagination. Literature of the 19th century is filled with stories of disturbed graves, haunted dissections, and shadowy medical men. Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, published in 1818, is often seen as a reflection of contemporary fears, not just about science overreaching, but about the cost of that overreach being paid by the voiceless dead. The legacy of grave robbing entered folklore, becoming a symbol of both horror and sacrifice. Even as grave robbing declined, its ghost lingered in culture. Cemeteries remained guarded spaces, and the relationship between medicine and society took time to mend. The Anatomy Act had calmed the storm, but it hadn't erased the memory of what came before. The long nights, the shovels, the stolen silence. The legacy of grave robbing is more than a historical footnote. It continues to shape how we think about the human body, medical ethics, and the nature of scientific progress. While the practice itself has long since faded into history, the questions it raised remain as relevant now as they were in the candlelit theatres of 19th century medical schools. What rights do we have over the dead? What responsibilities do the living hold in preserving dignity, even in the pursuit of knowledge? Today, the dissection of human cadavers is a carefully regulated process. Most countries now rely on voluntary body donation programs, where individuals consent during life to have their remains used for medical education and research. These donations are often celebrated and commemorated. Ceremonies are held, names remembered, and students encouraged to treat each body with reverence. It is a world apart from the silent, secretive transactions of the resurrectionists. Modern medical schools teach ethics alongside anatomy. The relationship between practitioner and patient, even in death, is framed as one of trust. Consent has become a central tenet, not just in treatment, but in posthumous use. Legal frameworks vary by region, but they tend to include clauses on informed consent, next of kin approval, and the respectful handling of remains. These standards are now embedded in medical codes of conduct, shaping generations of students into professionals. Yet even with these safeguards, ethical dilemmas persist. Controversies occasionally arise over unclaimed bodies used in some countries without explicit consent, or over historical collections of human remains gathered without permission during colonial periods. Institutions have begun to reckon with these legacies, repatriating remains, issuing apologies, and revisiting the provenance of anatomical specimens that once lined the shelves of prestigious universities. The shadow of grave robbing reminds us that medicine is not practiced in a vacuum. It is entangled with history, culture, and power. The very structures that promote healing can also reflect broader inequalities. In the 18th and 19th centuries, it was the poor and voiceless whose bodies fueled scientific discovery. Today, the questions have evolved, but the core issues remain. Who gives consent? Who benefits? Who is remembered? Educational institutions now use the story of grave robbing as a teaching tool, a way to connect students, not just with anatomy, but with the moral complexities of their field. It serves as a stark reminder that progress often comes at a cost, and that the advancement of knowledge must never come at the expense of human dignity. Public attitudes have also shifted. Where once death was handled with ceremony and superstition, it is now often medicalized, managed, and distanced. Yet the idea of the body, as more than flesh, as something imbued with meaning, persists. We still bury our dead with care. We still speak of respect for the deceased, and we still struggle with the tension between what we want to learn and what we are willing to give. In recent decades, art and literature have returned to the themes of body snatching and medical exploitation, not as horror, but as commentary. Films, novels, and exhibitions revisit these stories to examine the intersection of science and humanity. They explore what it means to study the body, to dissect life, and to reckon with mortality. In doing so, they ensure that the silent testimonies of those taken from the grave are not forgotten. Museums today often acknowledge this past. Plaques beside preserved specimens explain how they were obtained. Skeletons once displayed without context are now accompanied by biographies, when known, and respectful interpretation, when not. There is an effort, however incomplete, to give back some measure of identity to those who were once seen as tools. As we look back on the era of grave robbing, we are not merely peering into a grim corner of history. We are reflecting on a period of transformation, one where society was forced to confront its values, revise its laws, and rethink the balance between progress and morality. The resurrectionists, surgeons, lawmakers, and protesters all played a part in reshaping that balance. Today, medical knowledge continues to expand through technology, genetics, imaging, and simulation. But beneath it all is the same foundation: the human body and the desire to understand it. That desire must be tempered with humility, with compassion, and with the memory of a time when the line between curiosity and cruelty was crossed too easily. And so we close with a quiet truth that even in silence, the dead have a voice. And it is through listening to that voice, through remembering, acknowledging, and honouring, that we ensure the mistakes of the past do not become the methods of the future.